You are not imagining this, and you are not alone, because in the next few seconds, you are going to hear about a hallucination that has spoken to dying people, guided explorers out of frozen wastelands, kept sailors alive in open oceans, and appeared so consistently that psychologists had to admit it was not madness, but a survival mechanism built into the human brain itself. It begins when the mind is pushed beyond its limits, when exhaustion, isolation, fear, and hopelessness collide so intensely that the brain is forced to make a decision between shutting down or creating something entirely new to keep you alive. People who experience it describe the same impossible detail because they feel a calm presence walking beside them, speaking with authority, offering instructions, reassurance, and sometimes even physical direction, despite no one actually being there. This phenomenon is known as the third man syndrome, and what makes it terrifying and beautiful at the same time is that it does not appear randomly, but only when the brain believes death is near. Survivors report that the presence feels more real than imagination, more grounded than dreams, and more convincing than internal thoughts, because it behaves like an independent consciousness rather than a fragment of the self. Some describe it as a man, others as a woman, some as a shadow, and others as a voice without form. Yet almost all agree on one thing, which is that the presence feels wiser, calmer, and more focused than they are in that moment. What makes this unsettling is that many of these individuals are mentally healthy, rational, and fully aware that hallucinations should not be trusted. Yet they follow the guidance anyway, because something about it feels undeniably necessary. The first widely documented accounts came from explorers trapped in extreme environments, including Antarctic expeditions where men marched for days with frostbitten limbs while conversing with a silent companion who kept them moving step by step. One of the most famous accounts came from Ernest Shackleton's doomed Antarctic journey, where multiple crew members independently reported sensing an extra presence traveling with them during their most desperate march for survival. These men were not delirious in the way we imagine insanity, because they could still reason, calculate, and assess danger. Yet the presence felt as real as the ice beneath their boots. Later, mountaineers lost in whiteout blizzards, solo sailors adrift at sea, prisoners in prolonged solitary confinement, and disaster survivors buried under rubble would all report the same experience using eerily similar language. This raised an uncomfortable question that science could not easily dismiss, because how could the brain produce the same hallucination across cultures, time periods, and individuals who had never heard of the phenomenon before? The unsettling answer is that the brain may be capable of splitting consciousness in moments of extreme threat, creating an externalized guide whose sole purpose is to override panic and preserve life. When fear overwhelms the nervous system, rational decision-making collapses, muscles weaken, and hope fades. Yet the third man appears to stabilize the internal chaos by becoming a commanding anchor. Instead of drowning in fear, the person suddenly feels watched over, instructed, and protected, which restores the motivation to move, breathe, and survive another minute. This is not comfort in the emotional sense, but regulation in the neurological sense, because the presence often speaks in short, direct commands rather than comforting phrases. People recall being told to stand up, keep walking, ration food, avoid certain paths, or simply not fall asleep, even when their conscious mind wanted to surrender. The strangest part is that many survivors later admit they would not have lived if they had relied only on their own thoughts, because exhaustion had eroded their judgment beyond recovery. In this way, the hallucination functions like an emergency operating system, activated only when the primary system is about to crash completely. Modern neuroscience suggests that this may involve the brain's capacity for dissociation, where parts of the self separate to manage overwhelming stress. Under normal conditions, dissociation is mild and fleeting, like daydreaming or zoning out. But under extreme threat, it can become structured and purposeful. Instead of fragmenting into confusion, the brain organizes a single authoritative voice that cuts through panic like a blade. This voice feels external because the mind cannot afford the doubt that comes with self-generated thoughts. So it projects authority outward to make obedience easier. In other words, the brain creates someone to listen to when it no longer trusts itself. This may explain why the presence is often described as more competent, more confident, and more emotionally neutral than the person experiencing it. Emotion is expensive during survival crises, and the third man seems stripped of fear, hesitation, and despair. It does not debate, negotiate, or comfort in sentimental ways, but simply directs. What complicates this explanation is that many individuals report the presence knowing things they consciously did not, such as the safest route, the right moment to rest, or when danger was approaching. This suggests that the hallucination may access unconscious pattern recognition that the conscious mind is too overwhelmed to interpret. The brain constantly processes environmental data below awareness, including subtle changes in temperature, sound, balance, and spatial orientation. When conscious thought becomes overloaded, the third man may act as a translator, converting unconscious signals into direct instructions. This makes the hallucination less mystical and more functional, though no less astonishing. What is truly unsettling is that the presence often disappears the moment safety returns, leaving behind no trace except vivid memory. People wake up rescued, sheltered, or stabilized, only to realize that the calm companion who guided them is suddenly gone. There is no sense of loss, grief, or longing, but instead a quiet understanding that the presence existed only for the moment it was needed. Some survivors report trying to call it back in later moments of stress, but it never returns under ordinary circumstances. This suggests that the third man is not a companion, spirit, or guardian, but an emergency construct tied to imminent threat. The brain seems to reserve this mechanism for moments when survival is balanced on a knife's edge. Interestingly, the phenomenon does not usually appear during short bursts of fear, but during prolonged exposure to hopelessness, isolation, and physical depletion. This aligns with research showing that sustained stress alters brain connectivity, allowing unusual communication between regions that do not normally interact so directly. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and self-control, may temporarily loosen its grip, allowing more primal survival systems to take command. In this altered state, the boundary between self and other becomes negotiable. What we call hallucination may actually be the mind stepping outside its usual architecture to solve an unsolvable problem. This reframes the third man not as a sign of breakdown, but as a sign of adaptation. It is not madness that saves these lives, but flexibility. The brain is willing to violate its own rules of reality if that is what survival requires. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes a disturbing kind of sense, because any mechanism that increases the chance of survival, even by creating an illusion, would be preserved. The third man does not care about truth, only outcome. If believing someone is with you keeps you walking when stopping means death, then the brain will create someone. As this realization settles in, a deeper question emerges, which is what else the mind is capable of constructing when pushed far enough. If the brain can generate a guiding presence under threat, what does that say about identity, selfhood, and the boundaries of consciousness. The third man forces us to confront the possibility that the self is not singular, but modular, adaptable, and capable of division under pressure. It suggests that who you think you are may only be one configuration among many that the brain can assemble. This idea becomes even more unsettling when we examine what happens neurologically during these moments, because the lines between imagination, perception, and action blur in ways that challenge our understanding of reality itself. And as we move deeper into this phenomenon, we begin to see that the third man is not just about survival in extreme environments, but about how the human mind responds when meaning, identity, and hope collapse at the same time, which leads directly into what science has uncovered about the brain's emergency systems and why this hallucination feels more real than reality itself. As researchers began taking survivor accounts seriously, the focus shifted from whether the third man was real to how the brain could possibly generate an experience that felt so autonomous, so intelligent, and so perfectly timed to moments of near death. Neuroscientists noticed that the phenomenon appeared most often when three conditions overlapped simultaneously, which were extreme physical exhaustion, prolonged isolation, and a sustained perception that death was unavoidable. Under these conditions, the brain's usual hierarchy begins to destabilize, because the systems responsible for identity, self-monitoring, and reality testing no longer receive enough energy to maintain their rigid boundaries. Normally, your sense of self is held together by constant internal feedback loops that reassure you that your thoughts belong to you and that your perceptions reflect the external world. When those loops weaken under stress, the brain does not immediately collapse into chaos, but instead begins rerouting control to deeper, older neural systems designed purely for survival. One of the most important of these systems involves the brain's ability to model other minds, which is usually how we predict the behavior of people around us. This system allows you to imagine what someone else might think, say, or do, and it operates so automatically that you rarely notice it working. In extreme isolation, however, this system does not shut off, because evolution never designed humans to survive alone for long periods. Instead of going silent, the brain turns this social modeling inward and assigns it a new role. The imagined other becomes the guide. This is one reason the third man often feels like a distinct entity, rather than a distorted version of the self, because the brain is using the same machinery it uses to represent other people. Brain imaging studies of dissociation show increased activity in regions responsible for perspective shifting and decreased activity in regions responsible for self-referential awareness. This neurological shift creates the sensation that guidance is coming from outside rather than inside. At the same time, the stress hormones flooding the body suppress emotional processing, which is why the presence feels calm, detached, and unburdened by fear. Fear narrows attention, but the third man widens it. Instead of panicking about everything that could go wrong, the presence focuses attention on the single next action that matters. This reduction of cognitive noise is critical, because survival in extreme environments depends on conserving energy and minimizing indecision. When people later describe the third man as authoritative, they are often describing the absence of internal debate. There is no argument between hope and despair, no spiraling what-if scenarios, and no emotional bargaining. There is only instruction. Interestingly, the commands given by the presence are rarely complex, but they are almost always correct. This suggests that the third man does not generate new information, but prioritizes existing information more efficiently than the conscious mind can under stress. The exhausted brain struggles to weigh options, but the unconscious brain continues to calculate probabilities silently. The third man may simply be the voice of those calculations, stripped of emotion and presented as certainty. This would explain why the present sometimes seems to know when to rest and when to move, even though the person experiencing it cannot explain how they knew. It also explains why the presence is intolerant of hesitation, because hesitation wastes energy. From a biological standpoint, this hallucination is not an error, but an optimization. It compresses decision-making into action, bypassing doubt entirely. The reason this feels uncanny is because we are not accustomed to obeying thoughts without questioning their origin. Under normal circumstances, questioning keeps us sane. Under survival conditions, questioning can be lethal. Another layer of the phenomenon involves the brain's sense of body ownership, which can fragment under extreme stress. Some survivors report feeling as though their body is being guided or supervised rather than fully inhabited. This partial detachment reduces pain perception and fatigue, allowing the person to continue functioning beyond normal limits. The third man often appears during this state of altered embodiment, reinforcing the sense that someone else is managing the body. This also explains why the presence sometimes disappears during moments of intense physical pain, only to return once movement resumes. Pain demands attention, while guidance demands compliance. The brain cannot fully prioritize both at once. As the body stabilizes, the guidance returns. What challenges simple explanations is that the third man is not always perceived as a protector. In some cases, the presence is stern, emotionally distant, or even indifferent to suffering. This reinforces the idea that its purpose is not comfort, but efficiency. Comfort can lead to rest, but efficiency leads to survival. In a few documented cases, individuals reported resisting the guidance and immediately experiencing increased panic, confusion, and physical weakness. When they resumed listening, their mental clarity returned. This suggests that the third man is not merely symbolic, but functionally integrated into the brain's regulation of stress. It acts as a stabilizer, preventing total psychological collapse. One of the most unsettling implications of this is that the sense of self you rely on daily may not be the best version of you for survival. The conscious self is reflective, emotional, and meaning-oriented, which is useful for social life, but inefficient in life or death scenarios. The third man represents a stripped-down survival self that emerges only when necessary. This raises the question of whether identity is something fixed or something assembled based on context. If the brain can temporarily externalize decision-making to preserve life, then the boundaries of the self are far more fluid than we assume. This idea becomes even more provocative when we consider that similar phenomena occur in non-lethal contexts, though in less dramatic forms. Athletes sometimes describe an external guiding voice during peak performance. Musicians report feeling directed by something beyond conscious thought during improvisation. Soldiers in combat describe automatic action, guided by training without conscious deliberation. These states differ in intensity, but they share a common feature, which is the suspension of the reflective self. The third man may simply be the most extreme expression of a broader capacity for self-transcendence under pressure. What makes survival cases unique is the addition of isolation, which forces the brain to generate the social component internally rather than externally. Humans evolved to survive in groups, not alone. When the group disappears, the brain replaces it. This replacement is not random, but structured, purposeful, and adaptive. As safety approaches, The conditions that summoned the third man begin to dissolve. Stress hormones decrease, emotional processing returns, and the reflective self reasserts control. The guide is no longer needed. The brain quietly dismantles the construct without ceremony. This is why survivors often feel confused when they later reflect on the experience, because it felt real, but it left no ongoing psychological disturbance. There is no lingering delusion, no continued belief in the presence, and no desire to recreate the experience. The mind knows it was temporary. What remains is the memory of having been guided by something both intimate and alien. As scientists continue to study dissociation, hallucination, and survival cognition, the third man stands as a reminder that the brain's deepest capabilities reveal themselves only at the edge of endurance. It is not a glitch in consciousness, but a glimpse of its hidden architecture. And as unsettling as it may be to realize that the mind can fracture itself to stay alive, the phenomenon forces us to confront a final question that cannot be ignored, which is what happens when the brain chooses survival over coherence, and whether that choice reveals a truth about who we really are beneath the stories we tell ourselves. A question that leads directly into the final and most disturbing implications of the third man syndrome in the last section. As the final implications of the third man syndrome unfold, what becomes most unsettling is not that the brain can create a companion, but that it can temporarily replace the very sense of who you are without asking for permission. The presence does not introduce itself, explain its purpose, or seek agreement. Because in moments where survival is at stake, consent is irrelevant and efficiency is everything. This means that the identity you believe is stable, continuous, and self-governed is actually conditional, held together only as long as circumstances allow. When those conditions collapse, the brain does not protect the ego, but discards it. This realization forces a confrontation with the idea that the self is not a singular entity, but a collection of processes that can be rearranged when needed. The third man is not an intruder, but a reconfiguration. From a psychological standpoint, this challenges the comforting belief that consciousness is always unified. Instead, unity appears to be a luxury afforded by safety. Under threat, the mind becomes modular. Different systems take control based on what increases the probability of survival, not what preserves identity or meaning. This reframes hallucination itself, because not all hallucinations are symptoms of disorder, but some are tools deployed by a healthy brain under extreme conditions. The stigma surrounding hallucinations has obscured the fact that perception is already a construction, constantly shaped by expectation, memory, and emotion. In ordinary life, this construction is constrained by consensus reality. In isolation and danger, those constraints weaken. The third man emerges in the absence of witnesses, rules, and reassurance, operating in a private reality where only survival matters. What is particularly striking is that the presence often embodies qualities the individual consciously lacks in that moment, such as confidence, clarity, and emotional neutrality. This suggests that the brain is not inventing something new, but amplifying dormant capacities that are normally suppressed by social conditioning and self-doubt. The guide is not wiser because it knows more, but because it feels less. Emotion clouds judgment, and the third man is almost entirely emotionless. This emotional stripping may be the very reason it is trusted. In a world collapsing into chaos, neutrality feels like truth. Some survivors later struggle with the realization that their most competent version of themselves appeared only when their familiar identity dissolved. This can lead to existential discomfort. because it implies that the self we nurture daily may not be the one best suited for survival. The third man exposes a paradox, which is that the qualities we value in modern life, such as introspection, emotional sensitivity, and narrative identity, may become liabilities under extreme threat. The survival self does not reflect, but acts. It does not ask why, but only how. This raises unsettling questions about the nature of free will in moments of crisis. If the brain can override the conscious self and issue commands that feel external, then choice becomes a secondary function. The experience of agency shifts from deliberation to obedience. You do not choose to follow the third man. You simply do. This does not mean that humans lack free will, but that free will is context dependent. In extreme conditions, the brain prioritizes outcomes over autonomy. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense, because survival does not require philosophical coherence. It requires action. The third man strips life down to its most basic algorithm, which is move, endure, and do not stop. Another disturbing implication is that the presence often mirrors cultural expectations of authority. Some people perceive a male figure, others a faceless voice, others a commanding presence without identity. The form adapts to what the brain associates with guidance and compliance. This reveals how deeply social conditioning shapes even our most private experiences. Authority, once internalized, can be reproduced without society present. The brain becomes both subject and ruler. This has led some psychologists to speculate that the third man is a manifestation of internalized leadership models, stripped of personality and reduced to function. It is not a parent, a god, or a guardian angel, but the concept of guidance itself given form. The absence of emotional warmth reinforces this idea. Warmth is relational, while guidance is instrumental. The third man is not there to love you. It is there to keep you alive. Once that task is complete, it dissolves. The silence it leaves behind is not emptiness, but restoration. The original self returns, often confused but intact. This seamless transition is one of the strongest arguments against the idea that the phenomenon represents pathology. There is no lingering fragmentation, no persistent delusion, and no loss of reality testing once safety is restored. The brain knows when to turn the system off. In fact, many survivors report that recalling the experience feels different from remembering dreams or imagination. The memory carries a weight of authority, not fantasy. This may be because the emotional imprint was encoded during extreme stress, making it unusually vivid and durable. The brain remembers what saved it. This is why accounts remain consistent even decades later. The third man becomes a reference point for the limits of human endurance. It represents the mind's final line of defense against despair. What this ultimately reveals is that the human brain is not designed to preserve happiness, meaning, or even sanity at all costs. It is designed to preserve life. Everything else is negotiable. When pushed to the brink, the mind will sacrifice coherence, identity, and even reality itself if that is what survival demands. This is not a flaw. It is a feature. Understanding the third man syndrome forces us to reconsider how we define mental health. A mind that can adapt this radically is not broken, but resilient. It also challenges the fear surrounding dissociation, because dissociation in this context is not escape, but engagement. The mind steps outside itself in order to act more effectively. This reframing has implications beyond extreme survival stories. It suggests that the mind contains capacities we rarely access because everyday life does not require them. The third man is a reminder that beneath the narratives we construct about who we are lies a deeper system optimized not for storytelling but for continuation. This realization can be unsettling because it strips away the illusion of control we cherish. But it can also be grounding because it reveals that even when everything else fails, something within the mind is still working to keep you alive. The third man does not promise meaning, justice, or comfort. It promises motion. It promises another step. It promises survival. And when the danger passes, it vanishes without explanation, leaving you alone again with the familiar voice in your head, the one that wonders, questions, doubts, and reflects, now safely restored because it is no longer needed, and because somewhere deep within the architecture of the brain, a silent system stands ready to return only if the edge is reached again. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful or eye-opening, make sure to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe for more practical psychology insights, self-awareness tools, and mind-sharpening advice. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.